Good morning, directors. The following water report has data up to January 24th. Next slide, please. Now, we did finally have a break from the dry conditions we were experiencing. So over the weekend, we did receive some precip, bringing the January total to 1.25 inches as compared to the average for this month of 6.44. Now, looking in terms of the precipitation year, that puts the total to date at 6.29 inches, and the historical September through January is 19.02 inches. Next slide, please. And now looking at in percentage for the date, that's about 35.4% for the date. And when you're looking at the outlooks, we have the wet outlook ending around the historical average of about 36 inches. And then in the average conditions moving forward, we end up pretty close to where we were last year. And then in the dry, we're ending at about 16 inches. Next slide, please. So I do have some good news for you guys. This is looking at a 6-day precipitation forecast, and this is at different locations within the watershed. So starting kind of higher up in the watershed all the way down to the local area. So in this, we can see going to the end of January, we are going to experience some pretty good precipitation totals, especially coming up tomorrow and Thursday, where we see the highest intensity of those events, where locally we could see up to 1.5 inches in 24 hours. So these are pretty good values and should help to kind of, bring up those soil moisture totals. Next slide, please.
Olivia, I have a quick question for you.
Yes.
When you have the chart of our participation, the measurement of our precipitation, and you can see that Hetch Hetchy, Don Pedro, and Modesto are all different. So where are the gauges that are where for the input on that chart?
So those ones aren't observed precip, those are forecasted. And so the way that those would be confirmed is
I'm not asking that. So on your measurement for the precipitation of each day or each month on your precipitation chart.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Where are those numbers gathered from?
So we have, those are a 3-station index. And so it's averaged between Hetch Hetchy, where they have a precipitation gauge, another one in Sonora, and then one in Yosemite. So it's all of the upper watershed that's measured, as that's more indicative to what we would receive for, Don Pedro runoff. So that's kind of why we use those 3 stations for the watershed precip outlook.
And each of those stations are weighted 33%?
Approximately.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Now looking at the 8-day forecast, so you can see those precip totals we just talked about in that 6-day outlook. Showing up in these models, and there's decent model agreement here. And in the US model for the watershed, the next 8 days, it has, up to 10 inches as a maximum accumulation. And in the European model, you have about 9 inches. And, just for reference, the normal January total is just a little above 6 inches total. So we're kind of going to experience whole January, a month of precip in the next week or so. So definitely a big event coming up. Next slide, please. Now in the 16-day, the US model does have a little bit more precip, going up to 13 inches. So they're saying from day 8 to day 16, we'll receive about 3 more inches. So that would be a pretty good wet start to February. And then in the European model, it's only seeing, has a total of 10 inches. So that would be only a 1-inch increase from day 8 through 16. So that would represent more of an average start to February. One thing to note as you start getting further out, and with the way forecasts have been this year, We're going to keep watching that 16-day forecast, but keep in mind it could shift higher or lower in this case. Next slide. And in terms of how these events turn out as far as atmospheric rivers, we can see the event that's going to start coming in this evening and through the 28th is rated at a moderate AR. So pretty strong, intense conditions. So that's why you're seeing, in the local area up to, 1.5 inches in 24 hours. After that, we do see another atmospheric river event coming in right around the end of January and going into the first couple of days of February. Now that one is not as strong of a atmospheric river. It's staying more in that weak atmospheric river category, but it is it's a longer duration. So that's why you still get a decent amount of accumulation, but it'll be over a few days rather than 24-hour periods. After that, we do see it starts to become a little bit drier. So we'll kind of have to monitor how those, how the first week of February is going to go. Next slide. Now moving on to temperatures, this is looking at Modesto. For reference, the average high temperatures for this time of year start around 57 degrees and then drop down to about 54 degrees by the end of the 16-day period. So starting out, we are about 5 to 6 degrees below average, and then it starts to level out to pretty close to average by the end of the 16-day period. Now on the low temperatures, the average for this time of year starts around 41 degrees and then drops to about 40 degrees by the end of the period. So this first couple of days, we are seeing below average temperatures. Then it kind of bumps up to slightly above average. You're seeing, 5 degrees above average, and then it levels out to about 2 degrees below average by the end of the period. Next slide. Now looking at watershed temperatures. So this is looking at freezing level for these events coming up. So we can see this is definitely a colder event. Please note that on the left-hand side for the measure of freezing level, it is in meters. There is a conversion chart on the right-hand side for meters to feet. But just to kind of help out, for the event from the 27th to the 29th, where it's at 1,500 meters, that's about 5,000 feet. So that represents, 50% of the watershed receiving snow, and then the lower 50% of the watershed receiving rainfall. But this should help to kind of increase our snowpack accumulation. Next slide. And this is a look at the forecasted conditions for the watershed. So in green is representing the precipitation events that are predicted. So you can see that large spike in the green is in the next few days, the 27th through 29th, and then that longer duration one at the beginning of February. And then in brown, you have our soil moisture levels. So we can see these events are kind of helping to replenish the soil moisture in the watershed and should hopefully help with our runoff totals as well. And then because it is a colder event, in blue, you have our snowpack water. So at this moment, snowpack's running about 40% of average. With this event, it should help bring us up to pretty close to average snow levels for this time of year. So it's maxing out around 780,000 acre feet for snowpack water. Next slide. Now looking at city and county of San Francisco storage, they're currently at 401,000 acre feet with Hetch Hetchy at 201,000 acre feet. So they're running about 100,000 acre feet below where they were last year. Next slide. And as far as their releases, they've been holding pretty steady at 435 CFS with their diversions at 238 CFS. Next slide. Right now, Waterbank is at 544,878 acre feet with the maximum at 570,000 acre feet. I do want to know, I spoke with some of the operators at San Francisco, and they do plan to start kind of bringing water bank down. With this storm, they'll decrease their releases and try and kind of make up some of the empty space they have in their system. Next slide. Now this is a look at Don Pedro storage based on current conditions. So in the wet scenario moving forward, we have, you do pretty good. We still fill Don Pedro. Now in average and dry, there would be reductions, and we draw down to Don Pedro in the dry scenario, looking at almost 60 feet drawdown. And then in the wet, the average scenario, about a 30-foot drawdown. Next slide.
Olivia, is that updated to include today's forecast?
So this is where this next slide goes into, where we're including forecasted conditions to the end of January.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
the previous version was just based on the current watershed conditions without any future precip, just what we had received to this date. Now this slide includes to the end of January. I didn't want to draw it out any further just because the forecasts have been so volatile that I feel like it's better to include kind of up to 5-day maximum of what we would trust in the forecast. So this is forecasted conditions at the end of January. So we can see this precip event will definitely help us out. Wet condition, we would still fill Don Pedro, but we can see that, our average and dry, although these both can do still have reductions, they are nowhere near the reductions that were included in the previous graph, and we end up at a higher level in Don Pedro with the average, and we would be staying pretty close to where we are now at that 770 mark. And then in the dry scenario, you're at 740, so almost 30 feet higher than what we had in the last scenario. So definitely this precip event will help our current conditions. Next slide. Now for Don Pedro releases, average combined release is about 203 CFS, with the river being at 178 CFS. Next slide. Now for computed natural flow, for the month of January hasn't been that great because it has been so dry. The average CFS has been about 109 CFS, and that puts the total monthly acre feet at about 5,000 acre feet. Next slide. So when we're looking at the monthly full natural flow distribution, we can see for the most part through this water year, we've had below average full natural flow almost every month. Currently for January, we are running about 3% of average. I do think with this event coming in at the end of the month, it'll bump it up to being about 22% of average by the end of the month. Next slide. And for the accumulation, we're at 21,833 acre feet. So we are running below where we were last year at this time, and then definitely below what the normal DWR average is for this time of year. Next slide. So similar to what I did with the Don Pedro graph, this is only including forecasted conditions to the end of January. And I'm sure you guys all recall where these dry, average, and wet scenarios were sitting as of 2 weeks ago, where the dry conditions were starting to follow fairly close to what we were seeing as totals for 1977. The average was pretty close to a 2013, and the wet was falling close to average. So with this precip coming in, it does especially help on the dry end, where we're seeing the dry kind of coming in just around below 2013. The average is sitting below, right between 2013 and the normal average. And if we have wet conditions from the end of January on, then we can expect to have above average full natural flow. So it definitely shows you that one event can make a very large difference, but we're definitely not out of the woods yet, essentially is kind of the point of this. So definitely helpful, but we're going to have to keep monitoring. Next slide. And for the kind of total as compared to normal October through January, we're at 7.1%. Next slide. And Turlock Lake storage is at 7,675 acre feet. Next slide. And for the watershed status report, Don Pedro elevation has decreased about 0.2 feet since last week. And comparing to last year, we're about 20 feet below where we were last year.